Okay, so today we're going to focus on our second week, and that has to do with habits. Um, the readings that I signed for this week give you a lot of information about what habits are, how they're formed, um, how they have to do with our emotions, how they have to have a stability to them. They're a long lasting and very deep rooted characteristic of the person. We also see some of Aquinas's and Aristotle's differences concerning habits. I mean, for example, Aquinas has this idea that God can directly infuse somebody with a habit. Aristotle doesn't talk about that. And then with Augustine, we kind of see a little bit of what it looks like when somebody acquires a certain habit, and that habit is a, in his case, fairly destructive set of habits. But it becomes a deeply ingrained part of the person. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is to discuss something that I talked about in the reading guide, and that is this idea of a habit as something that we have, but also something that we are. And that seems like a very strange distinction, but hopefully I can clarify it a little bit more. Now, oftentimes we talk about something we talk about something that's not really essential or significant to our identity. For example, I have this computer that I am making this video on. But if I were to lose this computer, I really wouldn't be losing anything significant or essential about myself. Likewise, I have brown eyes. That's a direct and immediate part of my body. But again, if my eye color were to change tomorrow, or if I were to get contact lenses that have a different coloration to my eyes, I really wouldn't be worried that I've lost any important part of my identity. I don't think who I am in any way would change were I to lose my computer or my eye color or something else that I have. So oftentimes we think about something that we have, we think about things that are fairly incidental, accidental, non-significant, non-essential, that are part of our lives, but not in a really deep or meaningful or important way. This is not really the case with the kind of habits we're talking about. The habits we're talking about ultimately have to do with the sort of person that we have formed ourselves to be, the kind of person we have made ourselves to be. So these have to do with these aspects of ourselves that are actually tied to our identity. In other words, when somebody says, "Who are you?" somebody with a certain kind of habit or of moral virtue or habit of that kind, he would respond probably by talking about particular habits that are part of his life. A habit has to do with a significant and essential sense of our identity, in other words. And I think one of the examples I used in the discussion was about somebody who was kind. And we just kind of pause and reflect on that for a second. We say, well, this is a kind person. This is just who he is or who she is. That's her identity. So there's a sense of this as a part of the person's being. You know, we use words like this is who he is, this is her identity, etc. But let's also kind of reflect on the fact that kindness is not just something that happens spontaneously or just arises naturally or organically, right? I have brown eyes through absolutely no effort of my own. This is just something that's part of the genetic structure that I happen to have, and I didn't put any work into it. I didn't wake up one morning and say, you know, I'm gonna have brown eyes, and I put in all this effort, and then, golly, I have brown eyes now. That's not what happened. That was a natural process that I had no efficacy over. I I did not have any agency about, I'm not responsible for, I didn't put any effort in, etc. Kindness is a little bit different. Kindness has to do with the way we treat other people, the way we respond to them in situations. For example, if I see someone who is having a tough day and I recognize that they're going through difficulty and I can see the stress on the person's face, and I smile and I ask if they need help with something or if they want to talk about something, or when somebody comes and asks me for advice and really is spilling a lot about themselves and telling me a lot about himself, kindness would, in a kind response, I listen, I'm attentive, I'm patient, I let the person say what he needs to say, I don't interrupt him. All of this has to do with actions or behaviors on our part that are intentional. We have to put in effort to make this actually happen. It's not like having brown eyes. Remember, that was just an organic and a natural process. So, what we're seeing here is that something like kindness, which is significant or really important aspect of who somebody is, she's a kind person. Kindness is something we have to work on. Kindness is something we have to develop over time. It takes effort. We have to be intentional. We have to be aware of what we're doing and say to ourselves, I'm going to choose to be kind here. Um, so what I'm getting at is that a habit, which is part of us, is not part of us in the same way that, like, I have a computer or I have brown eyes. A habit is more tied to our very identity. And a habit is also something that we have to work on deliberately, and we have to take ownership of that process. Again, you don't just become kind through some accident of nature, through by being lucky, or because of your DNA, or because of your genetic code, or anything like that. It's not an organic, natural process the way that hair color or eye color is. It's something that we do because we choose to do it, and we choose to do it over time. So somebody who is a kind person is somebody who has made him or herself kind, and they've done that by repeatedly choosing kind actions over and over and over again, until such time as kindness is a deeply ingrained part of the person. One of the expressions we see in English is the term second nature. So what exactly does second nature mean? Well, something that is natural is something that often, a process that is natural, for example, is something that just happens automatically, it happens easily, it happens readily. For example, look at something like cell regeneration in the body. For example, the cells in our stomach regenerate, I think, every couple of weeks. And that's a process that's necessary for our survival. But it's also a process that we don't really have to think about, we don't have to plan for, we don't have to really do anything about, we don't have to deliberate about at all. It just happens pretty much automatically in us. It's a natural process. It happens by nature. I'll give you a second example. If you take an acorn, you put it into the ground in the right conditions, in the right soil, in the right time of year, and it gets the proper amount of rain and the proper amount of nutrition in the soil, and nothing comes to dig it out. What does that acorn do? Well, naturally or by nature, that acorn will grow into an oak tree. Um, I think it's a beautiful process. It's absolutely stunning to think about something that's that big growing into an 100-foot tall tree over a period of time and then standing firm for almost a century or more. Just It's a beautiful process. Anyway, but all that occurs by nature. It's a natural thing that we don't have to do anything to cause. especially that these natural processes, like I said, like the cell regeneration or the growth of an oak tree. However, as I've been saying here, habits are not natural processes of this sort. A habit is something that we have to work on deliberately. We have to intentionally practice this skill over and over again until it becomes a deeply ingrained part of us. Now, why is it called a second nature? Well, it's called a second nature because once we have acquired that ability, once we've acquired that habit, we can put it into practice very readily and easily, immediately, almost spontaneously. In other words, once we have a habit, it looks like it's something natural in us. For example, let's go back to the kind person. Now, as I want to reiterate, kindness is not in us by nature. It's a habit that we've worked on to develop. However, let's take an example of somebody who has developed this habit of kindness, and now kindness is a deep and essential part of who that person is. It's deeply ingrained in him now. Let's put this person in a situation. For example, this person is walking across the street and he sees somebody coming towards him, and the person he sees has a lot of groceries in her hand. Almost immediately, without having to pause and really think about it, the person who is kind will go to assist the other person who needs help with her groceries. He'll maybe take a couple of the bags and help walk her across the street and make sure she's okay. So he does this immediately. He does it in a way that looks natural, right? It looks to be the same automatic process that we saw with something like the growth of an acorn into an oak tree or the regeneration of cells in your stomach. Or even the motion of animals, for example, a squirrel scurrying around the ground. It's doing this naturally by nature. But again, we remember that this person who is kind, the kindness in him is a result of his practicing that kindness over and over and over and over again until it becomes a deeply ingrained part of him. So it's a second nature in that it looks like a natural process. It's automatic. You do it easily. You do it readily. You do it smoothly. Um, Natural processes are often very smooth. I think about a great blue heron, beautiful, wonderful bird. If you ever see these birds landing in a swamp or a kind of a pond area, they look like the best designed plane you could imagine. They barely break the water. There's no extra extraneous effort. They're not putting in a lot of hard work, it seems like. They just do it super gracefully. And I think something can be said similarly to how when somebody has a habit, they do they perform certain actions very gracefully. We'll go back again to this kind person. He doesn't have to like force himself to do it. It's not a real big effort. It's just boom, he does it. It's over. And he's very gracious to the person when he does so. He's patient with the person. So this is just a beginning overview that what we see with a habit is it's a deep and significant part of who we are, part of our being. That's the first point. The second point is that a habit is something that we've worked on to acquire. We've put in effort, we've been deliberate about it, and now it's become part of us. And the third thing is that a habit, once we've acquired it, is the sort of thing that we can perform or exercise as if it were a second nature. Why? Because it has those characteristics. It's graceful, it's immediate, we can do it readily, we do it easily. We do it in a manner that looks like something natural, even though the habit is ultimately something that we've worked on ourselves to acquire. It's not in us by nature, but by our practice. All right, now this is that's the overview of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to kind of we're going to circle back and get into a little bit more detail about that. So again, we have this idea of habit as a part of who we are, a part of us that we've acquired through effort over time, and a part of us that is like a second nature. Now, the first characteristics about it being a part of us, of our identity and who we are, I think is fairly clear. I don't want to get into too much detail because we can get off on some metaphysical issues that aren't super helpful. But the second part about how we acquire habits and how they become part of us, I think we can say a lot more about. So let's go with that. This next part of this lecture is going to be about how do we acquire habits. Now, I talked about the example of somebody who's kind, and I said, the person does kind deeds, and they're intentional about it, and it becomes part of them eventually, and that's true. But that position, that idea I just presented, requires a lot of fleshing out. We have to dig into it more deeply. We have to reflect on it and offer, I think, more analysis of what this phenomenon is actually like. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to turn to an example that I think is a little bit clearer and can actually demonstrate some of what we're getting at here. Now, the example I turn to is playing tennis. And why do I turn to that example? Because it's something I've done, and because it's going to offer some analysis of things that are helpful. Now, let me be very clear. Tennis playing is a skill and it's a habit of sorts, but it's certainly not as essential or significant as a habit like kindness. It's not as big of a deal for a person's identity for who that person is as being kind would be. But we can use it as an example to clarify and expand upon and articulate some of the ideas about how we acquire habits, how we form ourselves into certain people, a certain type of person with a certain type of habit. Okay, so let me get into tennis for a second. Now, I have when I was growing up, I played tennis occasionally. I'd pick up a racket, I'd do this, whatever. I watched some tennis. I tried playing it a couple times. It was mostly just the ball going straight up and then going down the other side. And my backhand was basically just kind of this ugly motion. And it looked pretty horrible. And I certainly didn't have a lot of skill in regard to tennis. And let me be clear, I don't think I have a lot now, but I have more. So I want to clarify how I got to have more skill. In the summer of 2010, I started playing with my brother. Part of what happened is my natural competitiveness kicked in. I wanted to beat him. I hated to lose, and I would break rackets when I lost. But I started doing something as I got frustrated. Instead of just getting frustrated, I started reflecting on what have I done wrong and how can I get better. So I'd actually watch videos of people playing tennis, and I kind of realized what they were doing. And the person I really liked watching was Roger Federer. Now, Federer is an amazingly graceful, beautiful tennis player. I think watching Roger Federer play tennis is a work of art. It's amazing. Um, I kind of think of it. He's sort of like a Michelangelo of tennis playing. But anyway, the point being, so I would watch Federer and I notice some of what he would do, and he would be moving his feet very often. He'd be in motion a lot, but he wasn't flat on his feet. He'd be on the kind of on his toes, so he'd be ready to move. And it was an easy motion. It was graceful. It wasn't, really forcing himself to run. Federer had a one-handed backhand, which I noticed I could kind of mimic in some respects. I never got the hang of a two-handed backhand. Federer would often go to his left to and then turn his body to still hit a forehand shot into the opposite side of the court. And I noticed I had natural foot speed to do something like that. And Federer played, but I also noticed I wasn't big on charging the net. That wasn't part of my game. I wasn't very good at that. So I noticed that I could play on the baseline a lot and use my speed to cover a lot of ground. I'd also picked up skills playing soccer and other sports where I kind of had some reactions that were decent, but I had to learn how to put them into practice for tennis. I had to take that sort of athletic ability and translate it into this specific context, into this specific sport. So anyway, over the course of 2010, I played a lot, a couple times a week, and again, I was playing intentionally. I was playing to win, but I was also playing to get better. So I would try new moves and see if they would work. I would feel what was comfortable for me, and I would go with that. I reflect on things that had gone badly or had gone well, and I try to incorporate them into my game. And I let myself just sort of rely on these skills that were developing. I trusted that as the process went along, I was going to be able to do this because sometimes I think, well, geez, I could never hit that shot. I could never return that serve. I could never make that serve, whatever. And that would kind of weigh me down. But eventually I got to the point where I didn't think about that as much. I wasn't super worried about it. I wasn't always trying to plan ahead, like, what am I going to do? And again, these weren't like, I wasn't even in a tennis league. I was playing with my friends. But I got to the point where I was actually okay. I mean, it was decent. And I couldn't always beat. There were some of my friends whom I couldn't beat, but there were some whom I was consistently beating. And I was able to beat my brother and then my other brother. And part of that, again, was I had gotten to the point where I was super comfortable playing tennis. I had developed my own routine, my own way of doing things. Like I said, I used, for example, that one-handed backhand. It was kind of, a lot of people don't do that. And I had tried to model myself, again after Federer to some extent, and eventually this just became part of what I would do on the tennis court. I would just kind of get into that mode, and would play against some people that had played tennis in high school and had been coached in tennis. I mean, this was all my own coaching, my own lessons, whatever, and I could almost beat them, and occasionally did beat them. And this isn't to brag, whatever. It's just to show that eventually that became a skill for me. That became a habit for me. But part of what I'm getting at here is that I had to kind of I had to be intentional about it. What do I mean by that? Well, I couldn't just hope it happened. I couldn't just think, well, I'm going to show up, right? And then I'll be a good tennis player. Well, that's stupid. Okay, that's like me sitting next to a piano and doing this and saying, I'm going to be Mozart because I'm hitting the piano keys over and over and over again. That's not something that's going to ever come about. All I will do is end up annoying the people who are around me and frustrating myself in the process of trying to learn the piano. So just showing up is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's just a first step. You have to show up in a mindful manner. You have to show up saying to yourself something like, how do I get better? What am I needing to improve on? How is that person doing it? Maybe that's something I can follow. Maybe that's something I shouldn't follow. You take ownership of the process, in other words, okay? So, did I have a teacher? Well, no, I didn't. And that was actually maybe helpful. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, learning a skill like tennis or piano playing or skiing or whatever, all of those can be done very well with a teacher, and that's great. But in my case, it was actually helpful to not have a teacher because, again, I had to do this on my own. I wasn't doing it just because somebody told me to do it or somebody encouraged me to do it. I did it because I wanted to do it. It was a personally motivated endeavor. So I knew ultimately that success or failure lay with me. If it succeeded, it was because I had wanted it and done it and kept at it. And if it failed, it was for the same reason. I hadn't performed it, I hadn't kept at it, I hadn't learned, and whatever. So even if somebody is taught a certain skill, Eventually that person has to take ownership of the process. It can't just be that you're doing it because your teacher tells you to or your parents tell you to or something like that. It has to be something that you yourself take responsibility for. It has to be something that you actually want to put into practice in your everyday life. It has to be a skill that I deliberately choose to enact. Now, that is not something I think that we often think about in terms of habits. Somebody thinks, well, you're taught this habit and that's what happens. It's like going to school. But even learning in school has to be something you take ownership of, right? In this class, I could give you all this information, I can offer all this opportunity, but if you yourself never take responsibility for it, if you are not motivated to learn, if it's not interesting for you, if you don't take an interest in it, you don't care about it, it's not going to do anything. So again, just showing up, just having a teacher, just having a lesson, it's inadequate. It doesn't cut it. Now it can be helpful, but it's only part of the equation. As the other part of the equation is having to actually be intentional and be mindful and deliberate about saying, no, this is something, a process I'm going to take ownership of and do the best that I can. So this is something I just want to expand on just a little bit. So humans are different from animals in this regard, right? Because animals, and Aquinas talks about this in one of the questions that we went over. Animals can be domesticated. They can be tamed and made part of human life in some respects. You know, hogs can become pigs. Wolves can ultimately be domesticated into dogs. Wild horses can be domesticated into domestic horses, and they can follow commands of human beings. They can work for us. They become essential to farm life, for example. It's really amazing the sort of things that animals can be trained to do. It's really amazing. But an animal doesn't have the capacity to actually reflect on what he's doing. He doesn't have the capacity to say, I'm going to be responsible for this. He doesn't have the capacity to actually ensure that he's trying to follow the proper model or paradigm. He doesn't really take ownership of the process in the same way that a human being does. So it's important to realize that this process of acquiring and forming habits is a human endeavor. Again, it's not just something that's natural. It's not just something that's in us by luck. It's not just something that's there because we showed up or we had a teacher or we took a lesson. It's something that is in us because we've acquired it in a deliberate, intentional, and responsible human fashion. We saw people we wanted to model ourselves after. We reflected on what we were doing. We tried to learn stuff about the game or the situation or the skill or the music or whatever it was. And we read more and more about it, and that got us more motivated. And we felt the pain of when we failed, and we felt the joy of when we succeeded, and that pushed us further. So it's like climbing a mountain. Somebody can drive you to the mountain. Somebody can give you a hiking equipment. They can even give you boots. They can give you a map. But that doesn't get you to the top of the mountain, does it? What gets you to the top of the mountain is putting one foot in front of another, in front of another, in front of another, in front of another, another, and then getting comfortable in doing that and realizing that you can trust yourself in that process and rely on yourself and following through with your motivation, pushing through when it seems difficult. So there's a mountain to climb, analogously speaking, when we acquire and form our habits. And that mountain is one way of thinking about it is it's our current way of doing stuff. We have to kind of overcome that in order to acquire and put into practice a new habit or a new way of doing things. But that process of climbing that mountain and coming to that place of a new habit is not something that's just accomplished by showing up. It's a mountain climb. It takes a lot of hard work and it's difficult. It wasn't, that was a lot of very muggy nights in Washington, D.C., playing tennis that got me to the point where I was actually a decent tennis player. And I want to reiterate, I'm not like an exceptional tennis player at all. but I'm okay at it. And I'm okay at it because I developed and acquired that skill in an intentional human fashion. I climbed that mountain, and now I'm pretty comfortable playing chess. Now, I'm not as good shape as I was. I'm not as fast as I was. I need to lose some pounds. So I'm not as good as I was, but I'm still decent. And part of that is, again, it's a result of a skill that I worked on to acquire in a human fashion. I climbed that mountain. All right. So that's kind of what it looks like to acquire a habit. And again, the habit we looked at was tennis. So it's not an essential or significant part of us, but it articulates some of what I wanted to get at. And that is that we do this in a human fashion. We take ownership of it. We were intentional about it. We follow through. We put in the work. We reflect on what we're doing. We try to follow someone's example. We use a person as a model, or we use certain people as models or paradigms that are worth following. And that holds for the kinds of habits we really want to talk about, stuff like kindness or courage or temperance. Those habits, again, are not in us just poof by nature. They're in us ultimately because we have intentionally worked on them becoming part of us. They're in us because we have intentionally worked on them becoming part of us. I want to reiterate that. I just did reiterate it, obviously. Now, that intentional process for becoming kind is analogous and similar to the process I just talked about in terms of becoming a better tennis player. What that means is, for example, if I'm becoming kind, I find and follow somebody who seems to really be a kind person. Now, that doesn't mean a mindless following or just, uh, like you just do exactly as the other person does. Why? Because the other person's not you. Now, I'll go back to the example of Federer. I could never hope to do about 90% of what Roger Federer does. So it'd be stupid for me to try to follow everything he does and just completely and mindlessly, like a robot, follow that example. No. Rather, what I did is, in a more general sense, he was the sort of person that I could see myself trying to be like in some respects. And the same thing would hold for our development of a virtue like kindness. You look at somebody who's kind and you ask yourself, how can I be more like that? Or you would ask yourself, what would that person do in this sort of circumstance? That gives you a framework, a motivation to try to follow, an example that you can kind of use to navigate certain situations. There used to be in the 90s these bracelets that said WWJD, what would Jesus do? Maybe it's a little trite, whatever. But I think it was helpful in some respects just to remind ourselves that, yeah, that's the ultimate example worth following. That's the person you want to model yourself after. So the person who is developing kindness, for example, might look at and really meditate on the Gospels, where we see Jesus being kind to a lot of people who are social outcasts, the woman caught in adultery, the woman with a number of husbands at the well, the little children who want to come to him, even his apostles who sometimes got to really annoy him. He always lets them come back and he forgives them. And that reflection on the life of Jesus, I think, offers us a sense of, oh, this is what kindness looks like in action. It's not abstract now, it's realized, it's instantiated. Who are the people in my life, like the woman caught in adultery, that I have to be kind to and not condemn? Who are the social outcasts, like the Samaritan woman at the well, that I actually have to be patient with and treat as a human being, not just treat as a moral pariah or a social outcast. So this process is intentional. You realize we're reflecting on it. We're asking ourselves questions and seeing how to answer those questions. We're not just showing up and hoping it works out. We're actually, again, we're taking ownership of it because we're saying, If there's going to be kindness exercised in the situation, I'm the one who's going to have to do it. The responsibility rests with me. It's on my shoulders. And if there's a failure to exercise kindness, it's not because I wasn't taught well. It's not because my teacher didn't do the right things for me. It's because I didn't do it. Again, if I missed shots in tennis or I couldn't return a serve or I kept missing on my backhand and I'd send it out of bounds, it's my fault. I got to do better. And likewise, if you're in a situation and you keep treating somebody badly and not helping the person out or being impatient, you're to blame. Now that's not a condemning thing, but it's just saying, look, I'm the one who has to take responsibility for the exercise of kindness here. Use the analogy of a mountain to climb. And I think it's a good analogy because it takes a hell of a lot of effort to get up a mountain. It takes a hell of a lot of effort to become habitually a kind person. There are a lot of really annoying people. There are a lot of situations where we just find totally demanding, that are stressful, that wear us out. It's not the sort of thing that just comes instantaneously or, again, comes naturally. It doesn't come naturally to be able to sit with somebody for an hour and listen to what the person has to say. And a lot of it seems really repetitive. We want to just kind of zone out and be like, oh my God, when's this going to be over? That's our sort of natural default mode. What I'm getting at is that, just like my natural default mode when I started playing tennis was to go like that on a backhand and just hit the net, I was able to make that a little bit more graceful, more efficient, and effective. In the same way, we can overcome the natural default mode of wanting to zone out when somebody's droning on for an hour and become centered, perhaps, and really be able to listen to what the other person has to say. Pay attention, be able to, you know, breathe and be confident that we can know what we should say when the time comes and create space for that person to be able to open up his or her own self to us in a non-judgmental and a compassionate manner. And this is what I mean by kindness as an acquired skill. None of what I'm talking about just comes instantly. Yeah, hey, maybe some people are a little bit more naturally attuned to that than others. I was naturally a decent athlete. Didn't mean I was a good tennis player. So you have to be intentional and put it into practice, and you have to take ownership of the process. I guess I just sum it up by saying, again, a habit that is part of our being, part of our identity, is a mountain that we have to climb. And if you just think about how you climb a mountain, then you realize that this process is not just about showing up at the bottom and having the right equipment and even a map or a compass or even the motivation. Those are necessary. They're not sufficient. You need to keep going. You need to put one foot after another. You have to replenish yourself. You have to reflect occasionally and say, geez, am I on the right trail? Am I going the right way? Am I going too fast? Do I need to take more breaks? You have to be mindful about the process. You have to keep encouraging yourself, and you have to take responsibility for what goes wrong and what goes right. And eventually you get to that top of that mountain. And what is the top of the mountain here? Well, as I'm saying, it's an analogy that you've reached a new habit. You've overcome an old way of doing things, and now you're in a new place. And this new place, once you're at the top of the mountain, you get a bigger view of things. I just want to kind of go with that for a second because when you think about an old way of doing things as a mountain, it blocks your view. You're really constricted in what you think are possibilities. So let's go with the example of somebody who's kind. Before that person has really developed that habit, they have a certain way of doing that we have just said is analogous to a mountain. Now, a mountain, again, constricts your view. It limits what you can see. Before you really get kind, you see people often as, you know, annoying or frustrating or stupid. And that's analogous to a constricted view that a mountain has in front of you. When a mountain's in front of you, you just can't see anything else. You're stuck there. You don't see any other possibilities, any bigger vista, nothing beyond that. When you climb the mountain, you realize there's a whole other range of mountains and rivers and forests. You even see towns, and all this stuff just opens up. You step out from the trees and you get to the summit, and it all opens up in front of you. And what I'm proposing here is that something similar happens when we have developed a new habit that overcomes a previous way of doing things. So if you've developed a habit of kindness and you've overcome the previous way of doing things, you've overcome the previous constrictive and limiting ways of seeing people. So somebody who previously was just stupid, annoying, or frustrating, you now maybe be able to see the person as someone who is suffering and have a deal of empathy for the person. Or you may realize that the person actually has a funny sense of humor and you can laugh at his jokes, even if they're a little corny and weird. Or you may realize the person has something in common with you and that part of what you were annoyed about in the person is part of what you're actually annoyed about in yourself. And that enables you to reflect on the fact that maybe your annoyance with him was ultimately annoyance with yourself, and therefore you learn to be more kind to him. But that opens up. What I'm saying is that these new ways of seeing people and responding to them open up to us insofar as we've overcome a constrictive and limiting way of interacting with them. Just as when you overcome the constrictive and limiting viewpoint that a mountain has when you're right climbing up it, you get to see a whole new vista that opens up before you. Okay, so that was any further articulation and expansion on this notion of how we acquire habits. The next thing I want to get to is this notion that habits are actually like a second nature. Now, I touched on this kind of briefly. I said it's something that we can do when we have a habit, we perform actions in a way that is similar to a natural process. It seems to be, for example, automatic, the way that a natural process is, or it doesn't seem to have to be forced in the way that a natural process is. So I think of an, again, natural process. If you go to mountains in the spring, water's flowing down them constantly. You don't have to force anything. The water just melt comes, the water comes down, boom. Um, in a similar way, when we exercise habits, when we put those habits into practice, it seems doesn't seem to be forced, so it seems like something natural, a second nature, if you will, earlier. Now, I want to just expand a little bit on that. The first thing to note is that even though this is something that is a second nature and we do automatically, it's not something that's done mindlessly. It's not like a process, again, a natural process we looked at was the regeneration of cells in my body. Now, it doesn't seem like that's a really mindful process. There's not a lot of mind at work there. Maybe in an analogous way there is, but I don't think it's a really mindful process. But I'm going to go back to the example we've been using of kindness because I think it's a good one. Now, again, we used earlier the example of somebody crossing the street who sees the person in front of him needing help. But he sees the person in front of him. He is mindful of what's going on and he responds to it in an immediate and direct and proper fashion. He does what he should, but he's not doing it, he's doing it in a responsive manner. Now, let's kind of highlight this for a second. A response is different from a reaction. In a response, somebody actually is mindful of what he does, is careful about what he's doing, is centered in what he does, and he does it from using his freedom and his intelligence. A reaction is not like that. For example, if I were to take a hammer and hit my knee would pop up automatically. There's nothing mindful about it. There's nothing free about it. It's just A following B following A. Think about Newton's laws, for example. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. This has to do with things like rocks hitting each other, bowling balls hitting pins, any kind of physical force being exerted on something else that causes that thing to react in a certain way. But in a response, we rather see somebody who sees a situation, is moved by the situation, like the person is moved with kindness, and takes appropriate action, not in a manner because he's sort of overwhelmed by the force, like a rock, like my knee was overwhelmed by the force of the hammer, or the pins are overwhelmed by the force of the bowling ball. Rather, in a response, somebody feels what's going on, but he, from within himself, takes responsibility for doing something about the situation. It's not as if in a response our emotions just compel us to do stuff. Because when we have a compulsion or somebody is compelled, they have really no agency or freedom or will involved in the situation. They're not the ones making the decision to do what they do. That's a reaction, right? That's a reaction where bowling ball hits the pins and the pins fall over, end of discussion. The force has overwhelmed them. I mean, the force of the bowling ball is not the force. In response, it's a little bit different. So yeah, the person who, let's go back to the person who was kind in his example of walking across the street. Yeah, he feels a sense of concern, for example, for the person who's coming. But he's not just being led around by his emotions. Rather, it's the case that his emotions have been properly disciplined, that they direct him to what's going on, and he seizes upon that moment and does what's right. So he is the agent who is actually exercising responsible action here, rather than just being like a bowling ball being pushed over by the force of a pin. Oh, I'm sorry. He's not, back that up. He's not like a bowling pin being pushed over by the force of the bowling ball, or a leaf that's being pushed around by the wind. He's moved by the situation, it's moving to him. He also has his own responsible input for what he does. So this response that we have in a situation is a human response because it follows from our intelligence and our freedom. But I just want to say a little bit more too about it. It's not the case that when you have a habituated response to a circumstance like this, you actually have to stop and kind of think about what you're doing. It's much more immediate. It's the sort of thing that you can just trust and rely on. And I think that's key. Now, I'm gonna say something about that for a second. And I talked about it in the notes, but it bears expanding on. I talked about the example of driving a car. Eventually, if you've learned that skill, other people can rely on you to drive them, and you can rely on yourself so that if you're going on a new road that you've never been on, you don't have to freak out and say, "Oh my God, what do I do? The car won't work." No, you just keep doing what you've been doing. Just a new road, it's fine. I think in a similar way, somebody who has acquired a skill and is able to exercise that, I'm sorry, somebody who's acquired a habit like kindness is able to exercise that habit in a in a in a good way in response to the circumstances as a second nature. That person can exercise that habit in part because he relies he he finds it reliable. He can rely on it. Let's just analyze that for a second. I think what's going on is, in those kind of circumstances, um, somebody can walk in, somebody can go about his everyday life and trust that if the circumstances arise, he will respond in the right way. Again, if I have the ability to drive a car well, I have that skill, I can trust that if I'm put on a new highway driving, I will respond in the right way because I can trust my skill to do so. In a similar way, somebody who has the habit of kindness can trust that in the various circumstances of his everyday life, the new people that he meets, the new places that he goes, the old friend that calls him up out of the blue, whatever, he'll be able to respond with kindness to those people because that's a part of him that is deeply ingrained and can be performed as a second nature. Person who is a good driver has that skill that he can draw from and put into practice as he gets on a new road that he's never been on. The person with kindness as a habit can draw from and rely on that habit when he meets a new person for the first time, or he has to respond to a new situation for the first time. For example, at work, having to lead a whole new work project, be in charge of a whole new group of people. It's the sort of thing that you can just put into practice automatically. And again, it's a response, not a reaction, but it's immediate. It's a paradox. And there's a certain way in which we can't really totally figure out what's going on. And that's, there's a deep mystery to most of human life. And this is one of those elements, obviously. But I just want you to bear in mind, first of all, the distinction between a reaction, like the bowling pin falling over from the ball, and a response, which is an intelligent and a human interaction with a situation. Second thing is again, there's this issue of reliability, that you're able to rely on the habit, draw from it, and put it into practice instantaneously. Again, we use the example of the person crossing the street who sees the other person in trouble or struggling. Now, it's not as if the kind person takes out a book and thinks, okay, well, looks at it and says, what should I do here? It's not as if the person has to pause and stroke his, of course, he'll have a beard, stroke his beard and realize what he needs to do. Those actually, I've actually noticed this in my own life. The more you have to kind of think about it in the circumstance, the worse off you do, because you miss the moment. You have to seize the moment. Now, this goes back to tennis for a second, because when I'm playing tennis and somebody serves me the ball, I don't have time to think about it. I have to respond to where the ball is and put my skill into practice. I have to rely on the skill that I've learned in order to return that shot. But I don't pause in the moment. I just respond, not pause, respond. Now, I said earlier that reflection is part of the process of gaining the habit, and that's absolutely true. But reflection is not part often of the exercise of the habit. Once the habit's acquired, it's more so that we put it into practice immediately in the context in which we find ourselves. I don't reflect on the tennis ball coming at me, I just respond to it. I don't reflect on the person struggling with her groceries in front of me, I just respond to her and her needs. Now, this might seem a little scary, right? Because it seems like Well, if you're not reflecting, are you still being intelligent? I earlier said it's an intelligent response. Well, yes, you are. And one of the reasons we can say that is because you've been exercising intention, intelligence, and deliberation in forming yourself to be that kind of person. So, my hitting the tennis ball back during a tennis game is an intelligent action because of the amount of intelligence I've done to form myself into the sort of person who can do that. That's the intelligence in action directly. It's not a stupid action. It's not a mindless action. It's just an immediate responsive action that is rooted in a whole process of formation in which I was very intelligent and deliberate about what I did. And a similar thing holds for habits like kindness. When we put those habits into practice, for example, assisting somebody with their groceries, we do so based on prior work that we have done. Again, we climbed the mountain, we put in the effort, we practiced this over and over again. And in that way, what we see is that the action is an intelligent action because it's rooted in a mindful, intelligent, deliberate, and intentional process that results in this sort of action. So I think I should wrap up this lecture. It's about an hour long, and I think that's a good length. And we've just want to note a couple things here. I'll reiterate what I kind of was talking about earlier. First of all, habit is something that we are. It's not just something we have. A habit in the sense that we're talking about, especially something like kindness, courage, temperance, etc. It's not just something we have, it's something we are. Okay, the second thing is that a habit is acquired through deliberation, through intention, through effort, reflection, through a mindful human process of climbing that mountain. And thirdly, a habit is like a second nature. It's something that we put into practice gracefully, immediately, in the context of our lives. But we do so in a manner that's rooted in the intelligent formation of the habit. It's an immediate response, it's not a reaction, but it's not mindless either. It's kind of this paradoxical kind of situation. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about with habits.